Thank you everybody for responding to my first video on hate speech. And I realized fairly soon after people started responding that there was plenty of material there for a follow-up video. What struck me as particularly interesting was that a lot of people responded by making references to what I would call freedom of expression. You know, the Americans mentioned their amendment, their First Amendment, but that means nothing outside America. I just happen to know what it means, but let's call it freedom of expression, the human right of freedom of expression. That was something that was brought up, and I found that that was a bit peculiar, and I was wondering why people felt they needed to bring this up. And the answer I think I have for that is that they felt that any reference to something like, for example, hate speech in itself contained or implied a condemnation of this, and a condemnation of hate speech would necessarily lead to suggestions of suppression, banishment, that sort of thing, like how do we stop hate speech? And that wasn't even my intention with that video. You know, the only thing I wanted to do is identify the thing so that we would call a spade when we see it. So I then got wondering about what makes this such a knee-jerk reaction to anything that remotely comes close to criticizing things such as hate speech. Why does that immediately provoke a knee-jerk reaction in some people, saying that, whoa, don't touch this now, don't touch this. You're touching freedom of expression. This is a holy, sacred cow. Do not touch. Do not even think about touching it. It's sacred. It's an inalienable human right that you cannot even contemplate diluting. Well, let me first of all reassure you that I have no intention of diluting such human rights. You know, the right to freedom of expression is indeed an inalienable human right, and we must defend it, no matter what sort of expressions we might find out there in the real world, and how distasteful we might find them. We have a duty to protect that freedom. And all the same, we have to accept that, as with any other human right, this human right operates within a limitation. Because human rights are interesting little beasts, and they tend to sometimes cause conflict between one person's human rights and another person's human rights, and in that case a compromise must be reached. And with regard to freedom of expression, you can think of fairly simple examples. For example, you know, you're walking into a church when Mass is in progress and start shouting off the top of your voice, for example, that God is imaginary. Now, you cannot do that. And why cannot you do that? Because those people have a human right, their human rights, to worship unimpeded, without harassment, without oppression. So, in this case there's a conflict, and the solution in this case is that you cannot do that. If you do it, you're breaking the peace, and you can be arrested for causing a public disturbance. And rightly so, because there's nothing stopping you from standing outside the church and voicing that opinion. So your human right isn't really being curtailed here. And that leads me to the next point I wanted to make about human rights, or about freedom of expression. Because you need to realize that freedom of expression is only a right that you have. It does not impose an obligation on others. And what do I mean by that? It means that you have a right to exercise your human right to freedom of expression by taking your soapbox, standing on it, and pontificating to other people. But nobody is obliged to provide you with a platform, except maybe government organizations who have to be seen to support human rights and have to be part of the law-giving machine, the law-enforcing machine, and therefore might have to help provide platforms for people. But no private enterprise, for example, no individual is under any obligation to help somebody else exercise their right to free will. So YouTube, for example, is under no obligation to allow people to post hate speech. And if they decide at their own discretion to remove such videos, well, if it is actually hate speech, and I've got a fairly narrow definition of what that is, as you know from my previous video, I certainly won't be lifting a finger to support them. They can go to the local park and spout their hate speech there, where I don't have to listen to it. And the final point I wanted to mention is very, very simple indeed. And this is simplicity itself. I mean, you or anybody has a right to express their opinion. But remember, anybody else has also their right to express their opinion. So if somebody decides to post hate speech, then it is no infringement on their right if everybody else then jumps in and expresses their opinion of utter disgust. Remember that, because a lot of people start shouting infringement of freedom of expression when somebody criticizes their hate speech. Well, you know, if you can spout it, somebody else can criticize it. Thank you.